In a strange and exciting turn of events, I actually have followers here on Tumblr now, so I have to thank Zone the God Anthropology for that. Anyways, though, last week I was telling you guys about the Celtic migrations, about this story we have about the Celts starting out in Central Europe and spreading from there to cover most of the rest of the continent. And then I told you that that actually wasn't true. It might seem like a bit of an educational rip-off, me going on about this for like 8 minutes and then telling you it's wrong. The thing though is that story is a really common one. It's repeated in a lot of places, and for a long time it was what people believed. Nowadays though, archaeologists don't think that the Latin Celts, those Central European Celts, actually migrated to Britain and Ireland. Why did people think that they did in the first place? Well, for one thing, the early archaeologists that started saying this, they were kind of fixated on migration. Their theoretical tradition gets called culture-historical archaeology, and they basically used migration to explain any change that they saw happening in the archaeological record. They thought farming came to Europe with a wave of immigrants. Then they thought this people called the Beaker folk migrated across Europe. Then they thought the Celtic migrations happened, followed by the invasion from Rome and the Goths coming down from Sweden. So there is a period of time when the archaeology in Britain suddenly starts looking more like the archaeology in Central Europe at that Latin period. They figured, hey, it must be migration. Nowadays it sounds sort of ridiculous, all this being waves of immigrants, but it sort of made sense at the time, and I'm not going to dwell on it too much, because in the case of the Celts coming to Britain and Ireland, the culture-historical archaeologists actually had more reason to believe it even than in other places. For one, we do know that Celtic migrations happened elsewhere. People did cross the Alps and come down into Italy. The Romans actually started calling the Po Valley Gaul Cisalpina. This meant Gaul, this side of the Alps, because it was being so thoroughly settled by Celtic peoples. There were also Celts going down into Greece. They wound up in Turkey. That all happened. Added to that, there's lots of mythology and pseudo-history from Ireland in particular describing invasions. In fact, one of the earliest medieval histories of Ireland is called An Leabhar Gabhlan Héireann, which means the Book of the Taking of Ireland. It also gets called the Book of Invasions. If you remember your Irish mythology, there's lots of descriptions of people like the Fenians and the Tuatha Dé Danann coming and invading the place. As archaeologists kept doing research in these places, though, they increasingly started to question this idea. In particular, a guy named Simon James came along, and he published this lovely book that says The Atlantic Celts. Ancient people are modern invention, if you can't see it on the camera, and because of this lovely library label. He said, we really don't have evidence that this invasion or this migration or whatever you want to call it actually happened. For one thing, if the Celts did invade Britain and Ireland, what happened to the people that were living there before? Because we don't really have evidence that they were suddenly killed off in mass slaughters, and really, the stuff from the period before the Celts supposedly showed up, and the stuff from the period after, doesn't look all that different in most places. You wind up with new weapons, and you wind up with new artwork in Britain and Ireland around this time. But how significant was that really? And it's just as likely that this stuff came to Britain and Ireland through trade and just through being in contact with one another as the peoples of Europe had been for ages. You didn't necessarily need big numbers of people actually moving there. The real nail in the coffin, especially lately, has been genetics. Geneticists like Stephen Oppenheimer have increasingly shown that if the British and Irish resemble anyone genetically, it's the Basques. Now, the Basque people live in the Basque Country, go figure, which is an area of Spain and France in the northwestern Pyrenees on the border between those two countries, just off the Bay of Biscay. Now, the Basque people are quite interesting, not least of all because of their language, which is pretty unique. It's actually really unique. Most other languages have relatives. Spanish, for example, is related to French and Italian, so if you want to say to sing in each of those languages, it would be cantar in Spanish, chanter in French, and cantare in Italian. It's fairly similar, right? It's because they all come from Latin. Over time the Latin has changed and it's mingled with other languages, so they look different. but they're still related. They're daughter languages of Latin. Basque doesn't have that. Basque doesn't resemble any other language anywhere in the world. It's considered an isolate. Least of all does it resemble the Indo-European languages that surround it. And why would that be? It's thought that the Basques have been living in their region for a really long time. They're thought to be descended from some of the first settlers to ever come to Europe. Now, if the British and Irish resemble the Basques genetically, that would imply that the British and Irish are also principally descended from those early European settlers. If there had been a big Celtic migration to Britain and Ireland, you'd expect the British and Irish to resemble the peoples living in other areas of Celtic settlement the most. But they don't. The conclusion this has led a lot of people to is that that migration never happened. Last week my explanation of where the Celts came from and who they were made sense because it was talking about a population that had grown and moved around. If that never happened, though, can we really call the people in Britain and Ireland Celts? Archaeologically, they did resemble the peoples in Central Europe in some ways, but that might have just been through trade and contact. It doesn't mean they thought of themselves as similar, let alone the same as those peoples. Can we call them Celts? Simon James would say we can't.